Well, it's really great to be with you again this week. Today we're going to be looking at Judges 6 through 12, particularly focusing on a couple of leaders who are known mostly for their military exploits, but also who have complicated and sort of tragic family dynamics as well. And those leaders are Gideon and Jephthah. Now, as we get into these stories today, I want to raise the question of how do leaders engage in diplomacy, in military or political strategy, in the context of God's direction, in the context of God's leadership of them, and how do they interact with people? Now, in the chapters this week, if you had a chance to read them, you'll see that God does show up a little bit. There's a place where God sends a spirit onto Jephthah. God is communicating through an angel of the Lord with Gideon. So God is directing these events. But if you look at the stories themselves, what you see is that the interactions are very human. They're very political. They're very messy. And one of the issues we have to address is how do we tease out in a story like this the difference between a godly, divinely led hero of the faith leader who is following God's plan and God is using them for God's own purposes versus here's a guy who has his own history, his own demons, his own prejudices, his own pride, and these different groups are interacting with each other in a way that shows their natural human rivalry. And I think one of the things you see in the book of Judges that's really exciting is this recognition that you have sort of two kinds of stories happening at once. And one kind of story is very human and very almost gritty in a way. It's down in the dirt. And then there is a higher story which is put together mostly in the editorial layer of God's direction of human events. Now, I ended last week's conversation with a discussion of how we are in our own messy realities and we're trying to make good choices, and a lot of times those choices aren't very clear and we have to choose between bad options, but that we can trust that God is using our maybe limited choices and sometimes our poor choices to push our story forward, to make our work part of God's unfolding kingdom. And that's the hope that we have, and that's really all that we can hang on to. And one of the things I really like about Judges is that it is really honest, really upfront on the surface about that kind of tension between the messy, everyday realities of politics and war and rivalries and families, and this larger hope that all of history is working together to see an unfolding of God's plan. But that is sometimes very hard to see in all of the ins and outs of what's happening. So let's start with the story of Gideon. Now, what you see here is the beginning of the story of Gideon, and it says that Israel has fallen under the sway of the Midianites. These are one of the, Canaanite, pre-Israelite inhabitants of the Holy Land, and now that they don't have a leader, this is after Deborah and after Ehud, they don't have a leader, and they are falling into their own evil ways, and then God is handing them over to the control of Midian. Well, one thing that's interesting here, I think, is that the Midianites are engaging in what we might call ecological warfare. That whenever Israel was planting their crops, the Midianites would come and basically destroy and consume all of their resources. And that's actually something that you do see in world history, is invading groups, engaging in a kind of despoiling of the nature or a stealing of resources, a kind of ecological warfare. So that's, I think, kind of interesting. And the result is that Israel is greatly impoverished and they cry out to God for help. Well, the person who comes is this guy named Gideon. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon under this oak at a town called Ophrah. And the angel says to Gideon, "You're a mighty warrior, and God is going to be with you." Now, let me pause here just for a second and call your attention to this kind of scene where there is a ruler or a leader or an important figure who meets an angel of the Lord. The word angel here in Hebrew means messenger. So this is a messenger of God, some kind of angelic figure. Often when these angels show up, they look like and sound like and come across as humans, just regular men, and then it becomes clear that they are angelic messengers. And then what's interesting is in Genesis, this happens a lot, and also here, it starts out as the angel of the Lord and then becomes God himself. God is talking to the figure through this person of this angel, and like it's kind of fuzzy or unclear exactly when that transition occurs. If you'll notice, so the angel is speaking and Gideon calls him Sir, if the Lord is with us. So he's referring to the Lord in the third person. And then the Lord turned to him and said, "Okay, I'm going to commission you to go fight my battle." So what started as the angel or the messenger becomes the Lord himself in the process of the speech. Now, there are several things like this, especially in the Gideon story and also in Jephthah, that I think reflect an ancient religious worldview. In the story of Gideon, some of these elements that reflect an ancient worldview include this idea of the messenger of the Lord who's coming, who's appearing. The idea that Gideon would need a sign, some kind of reassurance from this. You see this in a lot of the call stories from Moses and Isaiah, where God needs to send some kind of reassurance. And then you have the sort of testing of God in this story and in the Jephthah story, where Gideon sort of famously lays out the fleece, and he wants to know if this fleece is wet in the morning, then that means that God is with us. And then after it's wet that morning, he says, "Well, hey, I'm going to try it one more time." Maybe he's a little reluctant, and he tries it one more time, and the fleece is wet, and that's how he knows that God is with him. There are altars that are being built. There's a Baal altar. There's a golden idol that's being made later on. You have Jephthah praying to God with a kind of promise, a kind of manipulative promise to God, right? These elements, if you look at them carefully, they're very different from how we think about God. They're different from how we think about the way we interact with God, or the way God might communicate with us, or how we might come to know God's will. Now, so that's in the ancient world, and you think, oh, well, wow, how silly can they be? And the fact is that, we're also tempted by this, of thinking that, well, if I do this, or if I live this way, or if I give this offering, or if I, commit myself in this way, then God is going to bless me, or God is going to prosper me, or if I ask for a sign, God is going to give me a sign, and now this is for sure what's going to happen. I think even though we might sort of raise a side eye a little bit, or an eyebrow at some of these things that happen in the text, the fact is that it's a human desire for certainty. It's a human desire to know for sure what God believes or wants or is going to do, what God desires, to know for certain that certain things are going to work out the way that we want them to work out, right? And we want to find some way to get God on our side, to make God do the thing that we want God to do. And that's a very human feeling. And you see it very sort of physically or even viscerally in the text that we're looking at today. Now, a couple of things I want to mention about Gideon before I move to Jephthah. This is these are quick lessons. First of all, he begins by pulling down the Baal altar belonging to his God, belonging to his father. So here is in Judges 6:25. It says, God told him, "Take your father's bull and pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father and cut down the sacred pole that's beside it." Now, here are some of those ancient elements that I mentioned. In this text, there's often a stone monument to Baal and a wooden pole or monument to the goddess Asherah that are mentioned together often. So you have the standing stone or the altar, and then the sacred pole are often mentioned together. And these are practices rooted in ancient Canaanite religion. So Gideon's father has a very normal, very standard cultural kind of shrine here to the Canaanite gods. And God is telling Gideon to go tear it down. Now, what's fascinating to me, and this I want to put a pin in this because of the family issue. When it happens, the people in the town are furious because this is their altar. This is the thing that they're going to use to protect them or to give them guidance. You know, they rely on Baal. He's a storm god. He's particularly in charge of rain and things. These are very important to the people. And they come to Gideon's father and they say, hey, do something. What are you doing here? And Gideon's father says something very interesting. He defers. He chooses not to punish his son and to hand his son over to the townspeople. And he says, look, we don't need to fight for Baal. Will you fight for Baal? If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been pulled down. And that's how Gideon is given the name in the story, Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend for himself. We'll see that name show up here at the end of his story. So I want to put a pin in that. Here's a father given a choice to hand over his son in the interest of divine justice. And he chooses not to. And he says, well, let Baal's justice take care of itself. I think this is a kind of smart, slippery way to get out of it. And he's clearly, protecting his son from the people. And he's not too upset about it, I guess. So, any rate, after Gideon then pulls down the altar, then he becomes sent away to fight these wars, and that's where he does the fleece, where he puts the fleece out, and in the morning it's wet twice, and that's a sign that God is on his side. And then God says to him, this is in chapter 7, look, you need to get rid of your men. You've got too many men. Because if you fight and win the battle with all these men, then in the end you're going to, people are going to think that you won the battle. And I want people to know that I won the battle. And this is similar in a way to the defeat of Jericho in chapter 6 of Joshua, where Israel beats Jericho by marching around the city and blowing trumpets, worshiping God. And they just blow the trumpets, and then God tears down the walls. Like, that is not a military victory performed by Israel. That is a victory given to Israel by God. And that seems to be the idea that is operating here in this story. And so he, through this interesting process of elimination, narrows down his army to 300. Later on, when they start attacking the city, they have clay jars that they crash and they make a huge sound, and they rush out, all 300 of them, and God sends the enemy into a panic, and they run, and they end up basically winning a huge victory, military victory, and destroying the Midianites. Now, the story of Gideon kind of ends in an interesting little wrinkle. The people come to him and they say, we want you to be, to rule over us. The Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson. Basically, we want you to form a dynasty. And Gideon said, I will not rule over you. I'm not going to form a dynasty. The Lord will rule over you. Now, again, by way of connecting this to other parts of the Bible, in 1 Samuel, you can go read, the Israelites come to Samuel and they say, we want a king. And we want a king to protect us from all of our enemies. And Samuel is very angry and he says, God is the king over you. And if you ask for a king, then you're rejecting God as king. And in the end, God tells Samuel, yes, anoint a king, it's going to be all right. But there is this kind of tension in the Deuteronomistic history. Remember that word I used last week. In the Deuteronomistic history, there is a tension between the rulership or the kingship of God and the ruling of individuals that God uses to rule over the people. If the people desire a human ruler, it is seen as their rejecting of God as the ruler. However, you do see God using human rulers, endowing them with authority and giving them jobs to do to protect God's people. So there's this real interesting tension where having a human king is seen at the same time as evidence of the people's lack of faith and as evidence of God's providential care of his people. And some scholars argue that these are two different theological traditions and ideas that have been pulled together. Or you could argue that the editor who pulled all these stories together has a really nuanced understanding of leadership. That is at least the effect of it. And I think it's really fascinating to see that the story recognizes the double-edged sword of having strong leaders. A strong leader can be very effective when it comes to day-to-day getting stuff done, protecting the people. But strong leaders can also become stand-ins for who is our true leader, which is God, right? A strong leader can eclipse even God in terms of faith, adoration, love, allegiance. And what happens is people in the ancient world, and I would argue in the modern world, people will become so invested in the power and majesty, effectiveness, value, persona of a human leader that they then lose touch with the higher calling of attending to God, asking what it is that God is calling us to do, doing what God wants, serving God instead of and over and above any human authority or any human leader. And so Gideon is sort of sensitive to this and is sort of telling them, look, back up, don't do this. So let me quickly then turn, we're running a little long, to the story of Jephthah in chapter 11. Now, Jephthah has a complicated family beginning. He is the son of a prostitute and a man who had other sons by his wife. And when Jephthah is grown, the other sons of his father drive him out. Well, later on, Israel needs help against the Ammonites, and they come to him and say, come be our military champion. And he's like, what? You guys ran me off. I'm not going to help you. And then he says, if you will make me your ruler, I will come back. So Jephthah comes back as the ruler, as the general, and he fights a very successful battle against the Ammonites. Now, I want to focus on this, again, kind of like Gideon, where you have a very successful military campaign that kind of ends in something sort of downbeat, sort of anticlimactic or tragic even, right, with Gideon making that idol at the end. Here, Jephthah is getting ready to fight, and it says in this part in verse 30, Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return victorious from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. Now look what he's doing there. He is offering to sacrifice whoever, whatever, comes out of the doors of his house to meet him. Does he know it's a person? Is he promising to do human sacrifice? Is he thinking it's going to be a goat? Is sort of unclear what's on his mind. But he makes that vow, and then the Lord did indeed give him victory. Did the Lord give him victory because he made that vow? Well, again, on that theme of manipulation, we would have to say, no, that is not what God does. God does not give victories because of manipulative promises or manipulative rituals. However, this is how Jephthah experienced it. He made the promise, and then he won the battle, and so therefore it must have been his promise that gave him the battle. The fact is, we've seen God all through this entire book giving Israel battles and giving Israel victories because that was God's plan for them. And instead of trusting in God's plan, Jephthah decides that he's going to try to manipulate God. Well, When he gets home, as he's walking up to his house, the one who comes out to meet him is his daughter. Now, I think most of us, especially those of us who are parents, at this point would go, oh, well, that was a really dumb thing I did. And I'm sure that God doesn't want me to sacrifice my daughter. This is not what God wants. That in the rashness, heat of battle, I made a promise thinking that that would ensure our victory. In fact, what I should say is that God gives the victory, and we're going to praise God for his victory, and I didn't do the victory myself, and so therefore there's no reason for me to sacrifice my daughter. God doesn't want human sacrifice, and God doesn't want me to sacrifice my daughter. That's what I think most people would say. Now, it is true that there is a sense of, if I make a vow, I have to pay a vow, right? And the story doesn't judge Jephthah. It doesn't give us the meaning of the message or the moral of the story. It doesn't say, and sadly, Jephthah lost sight of God's true nature and decided to sacrifice his daughter. And it doesn't say, and Jephthah, even though it was very painful and difficult, decided to be true to God and fulfill the vow that he made. And even though it was horrible, he sacrificed his daughter because he had made his vow. And this is evidence of his faith and his commitment to God, right? I mean, we could fill in either one of those in this story. I would lean toward the first one. But the text doesn't do it. The text doesn't give us either one. Well, he says, oh, Lord. First of all, he blames her. You did this. You have become the cause of great trouble to me. I can't take back my vow. And then she says to him, well, if that's what you vowed, then you have to do it. So let me go into the wilderness with my friends for 2 months and mourn my virginity. And then he said, yes, go do that. So she went away for 2 months. And then she came back. She returned to her father. This is one of the saddest passages in the Bible. Who did with her according to the vow he had made. And so now there's this festival where the daughters of Israel go out and lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. We don't even know her name. She's not even named in the story. She's the daughter of Jephthah. And she's a victim. This is my reading of the story. All right, now this is admittedly very modern. This is me as a parent. I think she's a victim. She is a victim of Jephthah's pride. That Jephthah pridefully thought he could influence the battle by making a rash vow. Jephthah pridefully stuck to the vow he made, even though it was in direct contradiction to the nature of God as we know him. And the daughter showed a lot of faith. She showed a lot of, self-sacrifice, I guess. She's very compliant. And in that sense, she's being celebrated in the story. But her suffering was unjust. Her suffering is undeserved. So I think that there's an interesting question here as we come out of these stories for today. There's an interesting question about how we set up for ourselves rules or religious practices or ideas or laws, or rulers, or philosophies, political positions, where we start to confuse our position with God. Our service to our church, our service to our politics, our service to our country, our service to our community, our service to our family, that these things are important to us. But what happens is sometimes we start to lose track of the divine call that's above and beyond all of those human commitments. Can you get so tied up in doing your duty, in fulfilling your vow, in following your calling, that you lose sight of the God who called you? And it leads you to do violence. It leads you to do injustice. It leads you to inflict pain. It leads you to, bring division and sorrow instead of healing. These things can definitely happen and have happened. And I think that's what we see here in the Jephthah story. Now, that's my interpretation. As I said, the story's wide open. And so I'd love to hear what you think about it. Next week, we're going to be pressing right ahead, starting in chapter 13. And I look forward to talking with you then.